The female Tanagras embody a socially determined ideal of mortal femininity, in contrast to divine, that is defined by the competing expectations of modesty, beauty, restraint, and sexual allure. In the Greek world, it was considered a woman's duty to be desirable, to attract a husband, and bear children. A wife was consequently required to maintain standards of beauty, cultivation, and refinement. Sartorial elegance was also a marker of privileged status. Yet, male anxiety around women's unchecked sexuality as a threat to male honor meant that modesty in dress and behavior was simultaneously promoted as a virtue. Women's adornment was therefore always viewed as potentially treacherous. For this reason, laws restricted the color, transparency, and cost of garments that women could wear during religious rituals, while treatises warned women against wearing gold, jewels, and imported silk to protect their reputations. It should not surprise us, therefore, that in modeling an image of the ideal Greek woman, Tanagra figurines play with contrasting ideas of visibility and invisibility, and of propriety and ostentation, making the contradictory demands that society placed on women integral to the form and the fabric of her body. This is most apparent in terms of costume and pose. Most female Tanagras are conventionally dressed, like this one, according to contemporary fashion, wearing that long tunic underneath a mantle wrapped tightly around the body, often held in place with the arms, sometimes usually covering the hands, and sometimes pulled up over the head like a hood. Others wear a face veil, and we explored this last night, known as a tegidion, in this instance folded, if I can make this work again, here folded up over the crown of the head like a kerchief, and you can just make out these two dimples that are in fact the eye holes. If heads do appear uncovered, the hair is always carefully coiffed and controlled. Arms are often crossed over the torso or raised to the chin in a conventional gesture that signals modest restraint. As a result, these women appear swaddled beneath their voluminous drapery, their bodies concealed and constricted in a way that was deemed appropriate for public appearance, especially at religious festivals, but that simultaneously embodied the desired feminine ideals of modesty, propriety, and submissiveness that endowed the respectable wife with ideal beauty. And yet, at the same time as it obscured the body, the volume of fabric worn by Hellenistic women was finely pleated, meticulously layered and draped, and brightly colored with expensive dyes to attract the eye, to distinguish the wearer from others, and to signal her wealth and prestige. So too did the sophistication required to control and move elegantly within such weight of fabric. The care with which the makers of these figurines delineate the textures of different textiles, evoking the transparency of fine Kohan silk or Egyptian linen, colored with paint, made from the same costly pigments that dyed the fabrics themselves, suggests that the ways in which dress made the wearer visible and desirable was of equal importance to the expression of elite female identity, as was the performance of modesty. And even the poses worked to bring the body beneath the fabric to the fore. As Sarah Blundell notes, in almost every instance in which a woman is shown clutching at her clothes on Athenian vases, the gesture carried intimations of eroticism. And the same is true here. Even as they seemingly attempt to shield themselves from the gaze of onlookers, these figurines pull their drapery tight across hips, breasts, bellies, and thighs, effectively sculpting the body in a way that emphasizes its physical desirability. Indeed, their poses mimic the hip-shot coquetry of the Aphrodite of Cnidos, the famous cult statue of the goddess created by the Greek sculptor Praxiteles in the 4th century BCE that became the kind of prime model for representations of this goddess. And by doing so, the Tanagra's body language hints at the fertility and sexual allure of the respectable wife, but at the same time reminds their female viewer that only adornment offers mortal women Aphrodite's charm. But in the case of Tanagras, of course, there is no body beneath the cloth. They are completely hollow because they're made from a two-piece mold. In effect, these figures are their drapery, making tangible the prevailing Greek notion that the mortal female body was a clothed body, or rather that the dressed and adorned body was woman's natural state, as opposed to the heroic nudity that belonged to the male body. Pandora, the first woman of Greek myth, provides the paradigm, and I'm not going to read this to you, but it's important to note that she is constructed from clay, and she comes into being through this act of being dressed. She is one and the same with the finely worked garments and jewelry with which she is adorned, and that we heard yesterday how intimately intertwined Greek women's bodies and identities were with textile production and with cloth. This is, in effect, to reduce Pandora and all women that come after her to decorated surfaces, which for Hesiod and for so many other Greek writers was to define woman as both highly crafted and deeply deceptive. Pandora's beautifully wrought drapery and ornaments are as much a marker of her inherent craftiness as are her cunning words. Indeed, Greek and later Roman anti-cosmetic rhetoric consistently presented women's adornment as a deceptive art, closely and negatively associated with artificiality, to the extent that authors frequently likened women's bodies to luxury goods and to manufactured objects, including vessels and woven textiles, objectifying the female by highlighting the constructedness and superficiality of her image and suggesting her interior emptiness. Tanagras, of course, make this metaphorical hollowness literal by virtue of their being cast from two-piece molds, but they also make it visible. Almost all figurines have a square or circular opening in the back that may have provided access to the interior of the figurines to facilitate the process of connecting those two halves of the separately made parts of the figure from the inside. But one consequence, I think, of the large size of these openings is that they draw attention to the figurine's emptiness, as well as to its manufacture, making both intrinsic features of the idealized female body. That Pandora should, like the Tanagras, also be molded from clay only reinforces her status as an artwork. Clay is the original stuff of creation used to make mankind in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Greek mythological traditions, and retains its status as the archetypal artist medium throughout Roman histories of artistic production. Indeed, for the Roman historian Gaius Plinius Secundus, the origins of all art are dependent on clay. We are told that the first portrait was modelled in clay by the Greek tile maker Boutades of Sicyon, who created a likeness of the young man with whom his daughter was in love by pressing clay onto the surface of a wall on which she had traced his silhouetted profile. To make a body from clay, then, was in many ways to promote its status as handmade artwork, something rendered tangible in the many terracottas that preserve the fingerprints of their ancient maker. But it was also to engage with a literary discourse that frequently ascribed the same physical properties of clay, namely its malleability and the ease with which it receives impressions, to the female body. According to the philosopher Aristotle, the female of any species is softer, quicker to be tamed, and more receptive to handling and readier to learn than the male, characteristics that we might collectively categorize as being more easily susceptible to outside forces, both physical and mental. In texts by other male writers, women's flesh is considered spongier, more fluid and more permeable than men's, and more in need of binding and shaping. So the Greek physician Ceranos of Ephesus, born in 98 CE, writing under the Roman Empire, states that all newborns need careful swaddling in order to mold every part according to its natural shape, but that girls should be bound tighter across the chest and more loosely around the loins to achieve the ideal female form. As adults, Roman women might further manipulate the shape of their bodies by bolstering hips, corseting stomachs, and even stitching cork into the soles of their shoes, suggesting how the female body remained malleable and open to change, even if only, or perhaps especially, in appearance. That moulding itself should be considered a female act is reinforced by the language of pregnancy and reproduction found in the same medical and philosophical texts. The Greek word matrix can mean both uterus and mould, a synonymy exploited by the philosopher Plato, who imagines the womb moulding the fetus into shape as it develops. The potential for a womb to be like a mould is even made tangible in the prevalence of mould-made terracotta uteri, which is, believe it or not, what these are, dedicated as votives across Italy from the 4th to the 1st century BCE. Human reproduction in these ways of thinking becomes analogous to processes of mechanical mark-making and serial production, of moulding and of shaping. We might imagine a viewer of Tanagra figurines, therefore, understanding the reverse to be true as well. Cast from a mould that was itself cast from a hand-modelled prototype, then shaped and incised with tools, these terracotta figurines made reproduction through replication and through craft integral to the fabrication and the function of the female body, while at the same time embodying the common literary trope that likened women to vessels and reduced them to their wombs. Indeed, those figurines that showed draped women holding swaddled infants make even more explicit the conceptual link that is so deeply rooted in the Greek imagination between women's so-thought hollow clay bodies and their capacity for reproduction. Indeed, a parallel metaphor common in Greek literature equated women's bodies to earth, which was considered the quintessential womb, ready to be ploughed and sown. So we are told in the Timaeus, a text by Plato, that the male seed is sown upon the womb as upon ploughed soil, while the Athenian marriage agreement made between the bride's father and her new husband was probably sealed with the formula, "I hand over this woman to you for the ploughing of legitimate children." Not only does this reduce woman to a clay womb, a container for offspring, at the same time as reiterating the clay-like softness and permeability of her flesh, but such metaphors of husbandry once again center the importance of cultivation in the sense of both taming and of refining to the production of the female body and of female identity in the Greek world. The suggestion that women required shaping and then cultivating through adornment is a trope later pushed to an extreme by the Roman poet Ovid, who likens women's adorned bodies to a series of raw materials that are crude by nature but made elegant by artistry. Here, Ovid's woman is not just equated to the gemstone in the final lines that she wears, but also to the sensuous depiction of Venus engraved on it. The implication is that every woman needs work if she is to become civilized and to fulfill the role of wife and mother that society demands. But by working on her appearance, she is, of course, contrived, nothing more than a shimmering image carved on the surface of a polished stone. Ovid's analogy hints at the potential for female viewers in antiquity to see themselves reflected in the images of women that they encountered, in both material and in form, but also for Tanagras to be miniature mirrors and models for the women who looked at them. Even the Tanagra's painted surfaces, which so delighted 19th century audiences and surely informed Whistler's pastels and his experiments in colour lithography, suggested a visual and material correspondence between viewer and figurine. Most Tanagras were covered with a ground layer of white clay, such as kaolinite, which created a smooth surface that would bind well with applied paint. Women's faces were also frequently coated with a foundation layer composed of different clays and chalks, which aimed to achieve a smooth, pale complexion, which was a much-desired indicator of social status, and at the same time reinforces the potential for women's bodies to be clay-like in their materiality. According to ancient written sources, the most popular preparation was carusa, a mixture of vinegar and lead white, which was also a common ingredient in paints used to colour the faces of female Tanagras. White clay marl from the island of Melos, known as melinum, was likewise used to make white paint and to give a pale sheen to women's complexions. Analyses of white pigments used in surviving samples of Roman period cosmetics reveal common use of calcite and gypsum. Similarly, chalk dust was used in antiquity both to brighten the complexion and to make ceilings which carried the impressions of intaglio-carved signets, just like Ovid's spray-drenched Venus, suggesting how the female face could be similarly shaped and impressed with a new, more seductive look. Taken together, we might think of women sculpting their faces into plaster masks before painting them with added colour. As Kelly Olson notes, the literary sources indicate that rouge was the next most prominent cosmetic applied to women's faces in antiquity. Roman authors mention red ochre and red chalk as common ingredients. Like white lead, the former was also frequently used to create the red paints used for Tanagras and other painted surfaces, including the billowing drapery of this statuette of Nike. Likewise, soot, ashes, and lamp black were used as kohl to outline the eyes and darken the brows, just as carbon black was the preferred ingredient for black paint. As mentioned previously, the materials used to colour the vibrant costumes of Tanagra figurines were often also used to dye the real fabrics worn by Hellenistic women, including cinnabar, red ochre, madder, and Tyrian purple, made from the shells of the murex snail. And even the binders that were mixed with the pigments to make the paint, as well as the varnishes used to protect and embellish the finished surfaces of the Tanagras, find parallels in ancient cosmetics. Both are rare to survive, but were likely composed of animal or vegetable gums, egg and vegetable resins, all of which are listed as ingredients in the ointments and face masks women wore to smooth and polish their complexions. To purify the face, Pliny recommends a wash of egg white or a skin cream made from the jelly of a bull's calf bone, while Ovid offers 4 recipes for face packs that promise to make a woman's face shine smoother than her own mirror, including gum arabic, frankincense, and myrrh. Where it is easy to understand Tanagra figurines as miniature facsimiles of the women who may have dedicated them in temples or with whom they were buried, literature's emphasis on the make in makeup encourages us to turn the relationship on its head and instead to consider the female viewers of Tanagras as facsimiles of the figurines. They too were massaged and molded into ideal form, prepared, painted and polished with lotions and pigments, and finally adorned with costly textiles and jewelry, posed and artfully manipulated to attract the eye of the viewer and to suggest the desirability of the body underneath, a body prepared for marriage and for motherhood, to be exchanged as a commodity between father and husband, just like any other artwork. And we have seen, and just as we have seen, this synonymy is encouraged not only by the representation of contemporary dress and the suggestion of familiar and idealized contexts of behavior and action, but in the suggestive correspondence of Tanagra's material and the manufacture to cultural ideas about women's physical ontology, their earthy, malleable flesh, and their mold-like capacity for reproduction, as well as in the common ingredients of their painted decoration. If we accept the gendered associations of molding as a technique, we might also view Tanagras as female-made, at least conceptually. And this is further encouraged when we consider that molds were sometimes cast directly from other terracotta figurines, establishing family trees of mother, daughter, and sister casts, which evoke Hesiod's description of Pandora propagating the race of women, seemingly independently of men. Although we may in truth never know the gender of the artisans that made Tanagras in antiquity, reframing these figurines as female-made, female-viewed, and perhaps self-generated, I think gives new agency to their clay medium and to the perceived clay-like bodies of real women. We have hinted at how the poses that the Tanagras strike and the ways that they manipulate their dress acted as a kind of body modulation, so that they sculpt their form by pulling, gathering, and draping their garments into new shapes that echo the erotic curves of the Cnidaea. That this is so often done with hands and arms that are enclosed within the folds of the fabric that they handle reiterates that this is an interior, autonomous action, a moment of self-craft, perhaps, that encourages the Tanagra's female viewers to feel empowered by the opportunities that adornment presented to engage in self-production. If we recognize the erotic frisson of images of women shown clutching their clothes, then we might go one step further and even see the Tanagras as embodiments of the pleasures of self-expression through adornment, which becomes a form of self-love once we prioritize women as both the makers and the viewers of the adorned female body. Produced in multiples, and perhaps viewed serially, they establish a female look that enabled women to find pleasure in their capacity to satisfy the male gaze, but more importantly, perhaps, also to find pleasure in their capacity to shape a self that was visible, desirable, self-generated, self-sustaining, and able to define women's sense of themselves as a community. Thank you.